Hey, what's up everybody? It's Jared Hill with State of Tech, and today we're going to take a look at the GoPro HERO4 BLACK and the Sony Action Cam 4K version of this camera. These little cameras are very powerful. I mean, they're probably, it's a pretty big camera packed into a little body, what these are able to do. I mean, both these cameras are able to capture 4K video. They take relatively large photos, and they both have waterproof options. However, one is significantly larger than the other. I mean, if you look at the Sony Action Cam, it's quite large. However, it is narrow. The GoPro is a bit wider, but it is very short. So I get a lot of questions because I've been using these cameras and I've been posting photos on Instagram and Twitter. You know, which version of these cameras are better? Is the Sony better because Sony's been making cameras for a long time? Or is the GoPro better because GoPro has been making nothing but little action cameras for a long time? So it's a very good question, and there are benefits to both of these cameras where the other one falls short. So let's talk about those. I've used these cameras quite a bit. I bought the GoPro HERO4 BLACK when it first came out, so I've had it for a little while. I got the Sony Action camera right before leaving for vacation, and used it intensely during a 2-week vacation while I'm on the road with my family. So a lot of experience with both of these cameras. So a lot of people use these in the water, so we'll start talking about how they perform in the water. The GoPro does a really good job with its waterproof housing at deflecting water. Like when you come in and out of water, water kind of coming off of the lens so that you get a clear picture and you don't have water spots or water distorting your photo or your video. And with the Sony, you get a lot of that. The water doesn't come off of this very well. You have to kind of clean it off while you're filming after you get out of the water, so that way you don't end up with water spots, which pretty much makes for unusable footage. The GoPro still falls to that problem, but not as nearly as bad as the Sony Action Cam. So the GoPro, with its video format, is a MP4 video format that it produces. It's basically kind of a QuickTime video format, whereas the Sony uses its own video format. It also has MP4, but it has its own proprietary format, which I've grown to love because I shoot a lot of video with other Sony cameras, such as the Sony A7S, and we use the Sony A5100s a lot for video, and I like that video codec. It's very clean, it's easy to use. The MP4 seems a bit more compressed. So I have found that like when both of these cameras are putting out at the same settings, the Sony captures a slightly larger image as far as image quality and the data that's coming out of that. So the file size ends up being a little bit bigger out of the Sony when you're using the Sony codec. When you take that video in to edit it, it seems like there's a little bit more information there in that when you're editing in a professional editor. Most of the people that are buying these types of cameras are not really doing any video editing. They shoot a video, they upload it to YouTube or Facebook or something like that, and that's pretty much it. So in video quality, both of these cameras do a pretty good job considering how tiny they are, considering how small everything is, including the lens and the sensor on the camera. Now, the issue that both of these cameras have is that they don't have manual settings. They just have basically two kind of settings for the quality or the color of the image. On the Sony, you have natural and vivid. So as you switch between natural and vivid, natural would be more of kind of a flatter image, and then vivid kind of makes the colors pop. On GoPro, you can go kind of natural. It isn't really called that. It's called Pro Tune. So you can go Pro Tune and then turn on GoPro Color, and it kind of tries to make the colors pop, make the sky more blue, make the grass more green type of thing. And so both of these cameras have those settings. However, there's no manual settings really, so you can't really do anything to change the shutter speed or the aperture of the camera. The sensors that are in these are very similar to the type of sensor on a smartphone. It doesn't have an iris or anything in there. It has a maximum aperture and the aperture just stays there. It's not adjustable like on a DSLR style camera or even like a point and shoot camera. That is limiting, of course, but nonetheless, we're not talking about what you can and can't do with this type of a camera. What the GoPro has that the Sony doesn't have is the ability to kind of set exposure compensation. In the GoPro app, you can kind of bump the exposure up a little bit. I know it's doing digitally. It's not doing it with any of the hardware, but nonetheless, you can adjust that. You can adjust ISO and other things like that when you have Pro Tune turned on the GoPro. So there's some mild manual adjustments that you can do there. They're more like limiting the camera from going too far with the ISO in lower light situations. So not a whole lot of manual controls with both of these cameras. Using these cameras by themselves without remotes or apps can be a little bit challenging. However, you can make more adjustments to the Sony camera from the menu than you can the GoPro. If you remember GoPro back in the day, all you had was the little tiny menu on the GoPro, and you had to make all of your settings in the GoPro camera itself in the little menu. And then they came out with a remote, which made it easier. They came out with the app, which made it easier. So as long as you can carry either the remote or the app with you in your smartphone, then GoPro is relatively easy to change the resolution, to change different modes and stuff. On the Sony, you could change all of those things right in the camera. For example, when I was going to test 4K video shooting in these cameras, I was able to switch into 4K mode with the Sony camera without needing any app assistance or remote. And then with the GoPro, I was unable to do that. I had to launch the GoPro app on my phone, which takes a bit of time to connect. But once it's connected, the GoPro app is pretty good. Now, I have the remote for the Sony 4K. It's actually a wrist mount remote that also has a live preview screen. What I like about that is that you can control multiple Sony cameras, which with the GoPro remote, you can control multiple GoPros, but you can also see what you're looking at right from your wrist. It's a kind of a big, thing to wear on your wrist. However, it's much more functional than using the smartphone app, which is what you'd need to use to get to the majority of the functionality in the GoPro. You could also, they're a little remote, but then where do you wear that? Like if you're out in the water, where do you put that? You'd have to mount it to you somehow, attach it to you somehow so you wouldn't lose it. Whereas with the Sony one, it mounts to your wrist just like a watch does. It's a little cuff. So that's a neat feature. One of the other features that this Sony has that this GoPro does not is the ability to start and stop recording and from the camera being powered off. One of the things with an action camera, sometimes you just want to go and start filming. With the GoPro, you have to power it on, wait for it to power up, and then start recording. With the Sony action cam, I could just press the shutter button right on top, and whatever mode I left off in, whether that be time-lapse mode, photo mode, or video mode, it will start. So if I left off in video mode, just one press of the button, it powers up and starts recording. The new GoPro Session 4 camera, which is a small version of this, has that same type of functionality. So maybe GoPro will add that to something like this camera. Just press that button, it powers the camera up, starts filming. I think that's a great feature. So the cases on these cameras are, have always been a little bit crazy. GoPro has a lot of different case options for their camera. So to pop the case off, you simply snap this back and the camera pops right out. Pretty simple. However, with the Sony, you've got this little latch here. You pop this up, you've got to pull this out and then pull the camera out, and then you've got the camera out. Now, the camera doesn't really stand up too well on its own. It does have a 1/4-20 mount in the bottom of it, which is nice because you can mount it to a tripod or mount some sort of a bracket and use it with something like this Joby like GorillaPod type thing, which is a really cool feature. You have to use attachments to do that with the GoPro. You have to put it in some sort of a case in order to do that. The GoPro doesn't have any mounts in the base of it. So this camera can be used with or without its case. The Sony is splash proof without its case on it. This case simply makes it waterproof. So this case you typically aren't going to need. You can just use the camera as is like this and then put it in the case when you need it in the case. However, there's no protection of the lens when you don't have the case on it. And, you know, with these action cameras, you're kind of tossing them into places and putting them, you know, in a bag, and maybe they're bumping up against things. As long as your GoPro is inside of the case that you typically would keep it in anyways, it's going to be safe. This Sony action cam, once you put it inside of the case, takes up quite a bit of space. I mean, this is a large device once it's all assembled. It also has a lock button on top to prevent accidentally stopping your recording, which could be good. There were a couple instances when I was playing with my kids that I would bump this button and accidentally stop recording. On the GoPro, the record button is kind of recessed back in here a little bit. It's much harder to accidentally start or stop recording on a GoPro than it is on this Sony action camera. So also the Sony action camera does have a mount in the base of it, 1/4-20 mount for tripods. They also have a very similar platform that GoPro has, where they have these brackets that kind of slide in and out of the bottom. And this one actually has the 1/4-20 for a tripod, but there's also the adhesive ones for mounting to surfboards and helmets and the side of vehicles and all that good stuff. Sony has that as well. They're a lot bigger than GoPros are, which is kind of a pain in the butt. And of course, with the GoPro stuff, you can get them pretty much anywhere. Sony, you have to probably order them online. I have seen them at Best Buy, but they're a little harder to come by. Even accessories, as far as accessories go, GoPro, there are tons of accessories. Everybody makes accessories for the GoPro, not so much for the Sony action camera. However, because the 1/4-20 is built in, you can use, you know, pretty much any camera accessory that's made for a small camera. So we can't really say that that's too limiting between accessories that are available, because you can find accessories that will work with the Sony action cam. So time-lapsing is another thing that I like to do with these cameras. I did a lot of time lapses while we were on vacation, and one of the things I didn't pay attention to until I got home and I had shot a handful of time lapses is that the GoPro shoots time lapses in a full-size photo image. So it takes a picture, and when it's in that mode, it's taking a bunch of pictures at full resolution. The Sony action camera actually only takes like HD sized images, so 1920 by 1080 or 1080 sized image. So if you wanted to do something with that, like pull an image out of that time lapse that you were doing, you'd end up with a small photo, much smaller than what the GoPro was putting out. Now that didn't hurt me, because I was exporting those to put them on YouTube in HD, so it wasn't a big deal, but the size of the file was relatively smaller. And if I wanted to do anything with those images, they would have been smaller. I wouldn't be able to crop, because this image was already really small to begin with. So that was kind of a feature I did, well, not a feature, but it was kind of a limitation that I didn't know existed until I paid attention later on. In time-lapse mode, the Sony camera, definitely not as good as the GoPro. Taking photos, these cameras both take excellent photos. I had mounted this to the dash in my truck. We were driving up Highway 101 up north, which is really beautiful. You drive through these trees that just cover the road. It's like you're going through a forest tunnel, and it's really beautiful. And I took a lot of photos with this camera, because all I had to do was just tap the button. It would power up, it would take a photo, and then it would go back to sleep after 30 seconds, I think, because you know, I obviously wasn't using it. With the GoPro, I would have to either keep it powered up the entire time, because of the way that this camera operates, and then take pictures as needed, or I could just leave it in time-lapse mode and let it take a picture every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds or something like that. Because it's taking full resolution images when it's in time-lapse mode, it's much more usable for me. I can sort through the time-lapse of photos, find a couple that are good, and then delete all the rest. Not very usable in time-lapse mode with the Sony Action Cam 4K. Video mode, these both shoot 4K video at 30 frames per second. They both shoot full HD 1920 by 1080 at higher frame rates as well. And then if you go down to 720p, you can get 240 frames per second out of both of these cameras. So 120 frames per second at full HD is pretty darn good. You're able to slow that down and make a nice little slow motion video, being able to go and shoot at 120 frames per second. So slow motion definitely has came a long ways with these little tiny cameras. You're still getting MP4 out of this camera. You're still getting the Sony codec out of this camera. I feel that video is a bit better out of this Sony. When we're looking at the comparison side by side, the sky looks a little bit more blue with the Sony, whereas with the GoPro, the sky looks a little cyan. It's like not really the kind of blue that you remember it. You know, grass is also a little bit more greener, a little more vivid with the Sony as opposed to the GoPro. And this is directly out of camera. Obviously, if you're using a video editor, you can make minor adjustments to the color of your image and kind of fix those things. But naturally, the Sony does a little bit better. Even when it's inside of its waterproof case, it does a little bit better outside. Underwater, again, besides the fact that the lens doesn't really dry off too well on the Sony, the GoPro is just much better underwater than the Sony camera. Obviously, the Sony camera was built to go underwater. It just doesn't do that good of a job underwater. So if that's what you're buying a GoPro for, I would buy a GoPro over the Sony. If you're buying one of these devices to take photos, I would definitely recommend the Sony over the GoPro, because the Sony takes a pretty good size image and the image is a little bit higher quality. The color depth is there. The image is more vivid. It just overall looks like a much better photo than with the GoPro. Plus, pairing that with remotes, if you compare the remote options, the remote that's available for the Sony is way better than the remote that's available for the GoPro, because you have that preview screen. I was able to set the position of my camera without having to launch an app and change the Wi-Fi settings on my iPhone or any of that stuff. You just simply turn on the wrist, the wrist-mounted remote, and you're able to view it and set your camera angles. GoPro, you either have to buy the little backpack for it and have your battery life diminished because it's now powering an LCD screen, or you have to have Wi-Fi turned on so that you can use either the remote or the app, which is also going to use more battery life. Speaking of battery, you can replace the battery in both of these. However, you can get 2 GoPro batteries for the price of 1 Sony battery. The battery in the Sony is really expensive. I don't know why. It is a slightly larger battery, and I was able to get longer battery life out of the Sony than I was out of the GoPro. However, being able to get 2 GoPro batteries for the price of 1 Sony battery, you might as well just buy a couple extra GoPro batteries and leave it at that. The Sony can be charged via USB, same as the GoPro. However, the Sony uses micro USB, which is the same type of adapter or same type of plug that you're using for an Android phone and most other devices these days, whereas the GoPro still uses mini USB, which is slightly larger, and it's the only device that I have out of all of the technology that I have that takes mini USB these days. So it's kind of a bummer that I have to have an extra cable for my GoPro that I can't really use on anything else. So with the GoPro Session 4 that they just came out with, the GoPro Hero Session, they finally switched over to mini USB or micro USB, and in subsequent versions of the GoPro, they probably will make that their new standard. So all in all, what camera is better, according to my opinion? I think probably the GoPro. Simply because there's more options available for the GoPro. There's different case housings, obviously, lots of different things that you can get for the GoPro. The Sony, not really so much. With the GoPro, you have the app, you have a remote that you can get where, the Sony does shine with the wrist mount remote. However, that wrist mount remote is huge. It doesn't fold up very well. It's hard to, you got to take this big thing with you, then you got to take this big remote with you. It's a lot when you're trying to go out and just enjoy yourself and capture some footage to take all that stuff with you, when you can just use the GoPro and your smartphone, which you'll probably have with you anyways. So The GoPro seems to be kind of the winner overall, in my opinion, just because of its ease of use and the quality that you get out of it. The Sony has some good features, and if you're a diehard Sony person, like I've kind of became, I would, maybe stick with the Sony. But because I have lots of experience with GoPro and I have lots of GoPro accessories, the GoPro is just a better choice for me. So that's probably going to do it for this. It's a little bit of a review, a side-by-side on these. I know that there's a lot more details I could have went into, but I wanted to give you my opinion on these, having tested both of them extensively. So for more videos on GoPro and even this Sony Action Cam, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, the State of Tech YouTube channel. You can also check out our website at stateoftech.net. Thanks for checking out this video, and we'll see you next time.